Okay, looks like we are recording. As you can see here, we've been joined by a special guest. Say hello, Meme. Say hello. Hey, buddy. She'll probably be here for most of the time that we're doing this. Hey, hello. Yes, I'm right in the middle of something. Can you calm down? So we're going to start, I think, by looking at our assignment, which is due this Sunday. Get to window. Okay. So as you can see here, updated this a little bit for this class. Assignment 1. Psychology is all about asking questions and using different approaches to try and answer them. So what we've been going over in the first class, and we'll continue to go over today, is the different sort of theoretical frameworks or approaches of psychology, the major ones that we're going to flesh out a lot more over the course of the semester. And so we are going to try and use those to answer different questions that we might have about different things in areas that matter to us. In this case, what we're going to be talking about is academics. So what I want you to do over this assignment is to look at, I'll give you a little list of potential ideas you could explore specifically within academia, academic pressure in the US versus other countries, job status relative to education, then gender population psychology programs. Those are just examples. You can come up with your own. There's just like a gajillion different ways that you could go with that, but just to kind of give you an idea of the questions that you could try and answer. Like it says here, choose whatever topic you find interesting and ask a question about. I find that the most effective way to approach these sorts of things because we tend to be a lot more loquacious and we tend to do better work about things that we care about. And I want to put you guys in that position to where that's what you're doing. But also be careful, make sure it's something that can be studied and is academically appropriate. So I will leave that to your discretion. But for this one, I probably wouldn't take off points for that. But especially as we get towards our final paper, doing something that is within the frame of what a psychologist would potentially study is important. So the assignment here is, yeah. So I also said that if you have a question, if your topic is good or not, please email me about it. Once you've chosen your topic, you will form research questions using 3 of the perspectives we've discussed in class, and then explain why you've chosen that perspective. Okay, so the first step in the scientific method, which we'll talk about a little today and then more next time, is asking a question. And so we are going to approach whatever question we choose in 3 different ways. Okay, so there's also an example prompt down here at the bottom. List your topic at the top of the page and then give your answers according to the perspectives you've chosen. Think critically about how you want to approach the topic. Is there existing research out there in the world on what you want to study? That's an important piece of this. We talked about how in the example that we used in class the other day about the kids doing the yoga intervention, one of the first steps that you would do is look and see if there's any existing research on that kind of intervention, and then use that to kind of frame what you're talking about and synthesize that research into your own answer. Okay. Now we incorporate what we've learned about each perspective into your question. It's an important piece because the idea here is to bring in things that you have learned in lecture and in your own independent reading into your answers. Each answer should be about a paragraph long. The entire assignment should be about a page. So 250 words, 300 words-ish. See the example below as a template for how it should be formatted. You can submit the assignment directly or as an attachment. So you can submit it through this window. If Blackboard doesn't work for whatever reason, you can also just email it to me, but making sure we get that in by Sunday night at midnight. Okay, so you can kind of see here the examples I used. The topic I chose was differences in academic performance between in-person and remote learning. Relevant, as we are currently doing a video lecture because of our snow day. If you looked outside our windows right now, you can see a lot of frozen roads. Pets have had a big old time with that. So the 3 perspectives I chose was behaviorism. So we talked a little bit about Skinner and behaviorism, what those guys were all about. And so the approach I took with it was, and we're just going to go through one of these, so behaviorism. How are behaviors encouraged differently between in-person and remote learning? In-person instructors can rely on body language and subtle shifts in classroom responses to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. So in our current interaction here, I don't really have that. For instance, a warning glance or head nod is significantly more effective in an in-person setting where those movements can be more easily perceived. So if I was doing a video lecture, we were doing it live, and one of you guys had a question, or look confused, it would be a little bit harder for me as an instructor to pick up on that. Whereas if we were in person, it would be easier. Teachers can use these subtle communication tools to either positively or negatively condition their students to stop or continue certain behaviors. So we talked about operant conditioning, how if you're trying to lead somebody to continue to do a behavior, you reward them. If you're trying to stop them, you would punish them. Two similar groups were observed in these two settings. Hold on. May May, come here. Hey. Our neighbor's trying to leave his house. Best of luck, because it's a little chilly out there. May May, come here. Come here. Nope. Come here. Hey, hop up. Come. Time for this. Good girl. Sit. Good dog. Okay, two similar groups are observed in these two settings. How might their experience differ? So there's my research question. And from there, I would do an experiment. I would synthesize research to see if anybody else has looked into that topic. And then from there, I would create my own experiment or create my own, some type of design to add to that research base. And then the other two examples I chose were humanism and the sociocultural perspective. So humanism, we're talking about these guys that were very optimistic and believe that humans' main goal is to self-actualize and get to their basically ideal state. And then the sociocultural perspective, looking at different environmental factors and how that might impact performance. So specifically in the sociocultural one, talking about how the student's home life impact their home learning experience, which is obviously going to be a big deal. For instance, if you have a dog who likes to bark at things that she feels threatened by, that might impact your remote learning or remote teaching in this case. That could be very distracting. See, she's absolutely locked on to whatever's outside. Socioeconomic status can also be a big thing there, like how good your internet is, parental influence. So if your parents are home a lot and help take care of stuff, or if you don't have that much of a parental influence, that can obviously impact how your remote learning goes. And we sort of see a lot of this play out in real time over the course of the pandemic up to this point. But yeah, those are all good examples. And like I said, if you have any questions, email me before Sunday, but those will be due Sunday night at midnight. I believe that due date is correct in Blackboard. But with that in mind, we are going to shift back into our lecture. Nice. Play slideshow. Okay. So going back to, and we'll pretty much do this at every class. We'll do sort of a speed run of the stuff that we went over in the last one, and then catch up to where we were and go past it the next one, just because I like to review. All right, so psychology, scientific study of behavior and mental processes. We talked about that. Psychologists are scientists who study those things. There's a bunch of different ways that they do that. But getting into our first assignment, the question here is relevant. What specific topics or questions might psychologists be interested in? The answer to that is all kinds of stuff. But the first step in that process is asking the question that you eventually want to answer. We talked about the difference between basic research and applied research. Basic research is pretty much just collecting a very basic level of information about a topic, and then applied research would actually be like a correlational or experimental design to actually see if there is some sort of causal effect. All right, so our 4 goals of psychology: describe, explain, predict, and change. So describing, observing, and reporting existing information, or describing a phenomenon, I should say. Explaining, organizing, and making sense of observations. So bringing together outside research and your own research to sort of create this prediction, this hypothesis, this working theory, predicting behaviors or outcomes on the basis of observed patterns, and then change it using research findings from your own research to modify or change behavior. So that's our basic process. Talked about the example of the elementary school students and how we could do all of those things to try and hopefully improve their mental health. I talked about nature and nurture and how important that is, especially as we try and understand where a lot of these perspectives line up in terms of are these characteristics that these people are exhibiting inherent? Are they biological, like it says here? Were they inherited by parents, inherited by family members, or is it nurture? Is it more of an environmental question? Are we just this empty vessel that our experiences fill up, and that creates what we refer to as our psychology. That debate rages on, and pretty much all these perspectives are going to line up on one end of that spectrum. Now, Wilhelm Wundt, he would be a lot more, we also talked about objective versus subjective. He would definitely be more in the objective. And then he kind of more in the middle, nature nurture. He wasn't as concerned with that, I don't think. But the idea that he sort of introduced was introspection, examination of one's own conscious activities. The big thing to remember with Wundt is that he was trying to be as objective as he could be. So you see this instrument, this fancy doohickey over to the right of your screen. That was for measuring reaction times. That was what he was, the kind of thing he was trying to do, trying to get like good, solid scientific information and get a lot of it. As you can see here, it was highly rigorous. It was free from opinion, belief for expectation, just trying to get the hard data, which is, especially at that point, was kind of difficult. But Titchener, who was a contemporary of his, he was the creator of this idea called structuralism, which is similar to Wundt, sort of working backwards into the structures of the mind, but instead of getting objective measurement, he was getting a lot more subjective measurement. So early school of psychology used introspection. So what a situation that might have presented itself would be like, Titchener would have asked his subjects, what does this cup of coffee taste like? And if you ask 100 different people what that cup of coffee tastes like, even though it is the same cup of coffee, ostensibly, you would probably get 100 different answers because that's how people are different. And that was a weakness of structuralism that meant that it did not last particularly long as a school of psychology. Functionalism is persisted a lot more because it is not so much concerned with the sort of origin of these psychological patterns, but more so, like the name would suggest, the function of them. So on how processes, feelings, behaviors help us adapt to the environment. So it's a lot more towards the biological perspective, influenced a lot of educational psychology, emotional research, and comparative animal research. So we talked about famous ladies, Mary White and Calkins, first female president of the APA, Margaret Floyd Washburn, first female to earn a PhD in psychology, even though Mary White and Calkins had all the requirements, but she was not granted that degree. And then Mamie Phipps Clark. Important things with her, I would probably, out of the three, Mamie Phipps Clark would probably be the one that I would ask a question about, because of the influence that her work had on Brown versus Board of Education. Still a very relevant Supreme Court case. She was the first Black woman to be awarded a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. We talked about how, especially early on in the days of psychology, and even up to today contemporarily, number of women earning doctorates in psychology does not mirror the number of women that sort of permeate those programs, which is true in our classes too. Here is a very basic list of all of our perspectives. I talked about psychoanalysis and Freud and the idea that a lot of our subconscious experience and past experience shapes our current psychology. That was all of what Freud's work is about. Especially early childhood experiences. But we also talked about how his talk therapy helped relieve a lot of people's mental health symptoms, even if his work was not overly scientific, and a lot of people still pretty vehemently disagree with it. Freud psychoanalysis, that's the big takeaway from there. Behaviorism, there's a couple more people, but behaviorism, like it says here, study of observable behavior, trying to figure out why people do the things that they do. And that comes down to really two big ideas. So we have classical conditioning, which is conditioning by association, and operant conditioning, which is conditioning by punishment and reward. The behavioral perspective itself is just that behavior is primarily learned through associations. So going back to our nature versus nurture debate, this is very much more nurture. Associations, reinforcers, and observation. Because all of this is under the learning umbrella that we will talk about a lot in chapters 5 and 6. They were strong advocates for the role of nurture, like I said a second ago, determining our behavior and mental processes. Also, just real quick, we talked about how classical conditioning is association. So I mentioned how like advertising uses that pretty heavily to connect like a brand logo or some kind of brand product with a person, typically like a spokesperson, to try and piggyback off of their good standing. And then operant conditioning, we talked about like teaching my dog to sit, and how like every time she did it at first, we would give her a treat. We're trying to reward her for doing that specific behavior so that hopefully she can continue to do it in the future, which she does like a champ. All right, so humanism, we talked about that a second ago, but human nature idea here is that it's by and large positive, that human direction is towards growth. And their whole goal here was to study the psychology of self-actualization. So get into basically your ideal self. Key figures here, Carl Rogers and then Abraham Maslow. We talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We'll come back to that a good bit over the course of the semester. And this kind of came as a response to behaviorism psychoanalysis, which were a lot more under the impression that people were sort of robots that just responded to their environment and didn't have a ton of agency in the way that they behaved. And the humanists were like, that's not true. Right, so cognitive perspective, we talked about how cognition, most of the time we're talking about things that are happening inside your head. So like it says here, examining the mental processes that direct behavior specifically, we go down to the cognitive neuroscience piece there. So this is actually getting into the physiology, the chemistry of your brain and how that affects the way we behave. We talked about George Miller and his 7+2 research, the idea that you can pretty much only keep between 5 and 9 bits of information in your head at one time. We talked about how there's kind of a way to hack that, the idea of chunking, that you can sort of group chunks of those information together. Yeah, so more going back to our structuralism question, but through things like cognitive neuroscience, we can actually look at the legit structures of the brain and not sort of have to guess subjectively what each thing does. So there's a lot of psychology research, especially early on, that was trying to figure out which parts of the brain did what. And it didn't really get like super scientific until we started doing a lot of investigation of the actual brain itself. We'll talk about that a good bit later. Okay, evolutionary perspective approach that knowledge, evolutionary forces, just natural selection to understand behavior. So sort of a sister theory of natural selection. So if we see this little birdie right here, it's the idea that depending on where that bird lived, what kind of food it was trying to hunt, its beak size would change. And over the course of time, like that it would adapt to wherever it had chosen to live. And that behaviors work the exact same way. So like eventually your brain will sort of purge certain behaviors based on your environment. The example I used was like people who grow up in places like the Netherlands or Belgium. They have a lot of different, very prevalent linguistic cultures around them, typically grow up learning a multitude of different languages, whether that's French, German, Flemish. They have, language that they speak at their house, like that's, and the question there was, are they sort of naturally more predisposed to learning languages, or is that just an environmental thing? The evolutionary perspective would say that is a natural thing. Biological perspective is very similar, obviously, because biology and evolution are going to go pretty much hand in hand. So underlying physiology to explain behavior and mental processes, the idea that things like your hormones, genetics, brain activity, all of that is going to influence the way that you behave and the way that your brain works. So I mentioned how your brain is going to look very different if you are on spring break and don't have a care in the world than if you are right in the middle of exam week and you are about to take the biggest test of your life. Hello, dear.
Hey.
Do you want to say hey?
To you.
To my classes?
Oh, sure.
This is my wife, Tara.
Hi, guys.
Okay. So neuroscience, study the brain and nervous system, exactly what it says on the tin. Sociocultural perspective. So in this case, we're talking about how social interactions and culture influence behavior and mental processes. So basically, remember here that like, a kid growing up in South Carolina is going to have a very different experience than a kid growing up in Zimbabwe. And those differences are very important in trying to understand their different psychologies, because norms, we're going to talk about norms a good bit over the course of the semester, are different across cultures. And typically we interpret someone's psychology relative to norms, which can be a mistake. Okay, especially measuring them against our norms is not a good idea. Okay, biopsychosocial perspective, like it says, it's kind of a combination of all of the things we've already talked about. It's adopted by scientists across many disciplines. The example they use here is healthcare, because something like healthcare is a very big question, and you want to incorporate as many approaches as you can to try and answer that question. Because if you just go from one, so let's say biological perspective, that is going to sort of not be super representative of everybody within that sample if you make decisions based on biology. Whereas, like we said a second ago, norms are different across cultures. Socioeconomic factors different across cultures, and we can't just make decisions based on one aspect of this. So biopsychosocial incorporates all of them. This is an interesting little exercise here. Identify a movie or television show that's familiar to all members of your group. We don't do a ton of group work here, but it's good for you to do independently. So picking a scene that shows a character exhibiting inappropriate or risky behavior. So those are all over the place, but trying to explain that behavior using at least two of the perspectives of psychology is very similar to the assignment that I've given you of just looking at something, some sort of phenomenon, and trying to interpret it through a psychological lens. Because if I teach you how to do anything over the course of the semester, that's really what we're after here, is to kind of filter things that you see culturally, things that you see, like it says, through media, which we're going to talk about a good bit. How like mental disorders get represented in movies and things like that. And then using the perspectives that we have already outlined and will continue to outline to explain those behaviors, because that's what we do. Here is that lovely chart that gives you name of the perspective, the main idea of the perspective, and then the questions that psychologists ask. And like I said last time, what I might also do is add the names of the significant figures here, because on the test, I would ask you which name, which went with which perspective, which main idea went with which perspective. And then there will be some more problem solving, critical thinking kind of questions, which are going to be more along the lines of the questions that psychologists ask. So I might give you a situation where, somebody, I give you a question that involves like natural selection or evolution of certain behaviors, and then it's your job to sort of work backwards and link that to the evolutionary perspective. Okay, so this is pretty much your assignment. All right, so we are now moving on to new stuff. So starting with the scientific method. Everybody has heard the scientific method. This is a process scientists use to conduct research, includes a continuing cycle of exploration, critical thinking, and systematic observation. Okay, trying to refute or support a hypothesis. So when we get to that point where we're actually making a prediction about what will happen based on our observations, we make a hypothesis, make it, basically an if-then statement that can be used to test a prediction. Experiment here being defined as a controlled procedure that involves careful examination through the use of scientific observation and or manipulation of variables. So we're going to talk a lot more about variables and how good experiments can be set up, and maybe more importantly, how good experiments can not be set up. Because a lot of times you'll hear, this study shows this, and you can pretty much use a study to show whatever you want. Okay, so the 5 steps of the scientific method starts with the question, which is exactly what we're doing in our assignment, developing a hypothesis based on that question and what has already been researched about that question, designing the study and collecting data, analyzing that data, and then finally publishing the findings. We'll also talk about how publishing the findings and the analysis of that data is important for other people to hopefully replicate your experiment, because that's part of what makes a good experiment. So how do psychologists come up with their questions? So the first point here is curiosity. So looking at everyday observations, things that are just like, happen in your world, and wondering how they got to be that way, and how people's different behavioral patterns led to them being that way. And then also reading articles and books. So a lot of research that's already been done has been published. So reading those articles wherein that research is outlined or detailed, and then books, also an important piece of that. So basically what we're saying here is using your own internal curiosity, and then using external resources to hopefully create more questions, because that's, like it says back here, it's this cycle: exploration, critical thinking, and observation. And then we go back to the beginning. It's back to exploration, because we're going to have more questions ideally. Difference between a research question and a hypothesis. Okay, so research question is a lot more broad. A hypothesis is a prediction, and it's based on that research question. So I might ask the question, how does remote learning impact people's test scores on like something like the ACT? So a hypothesis would be, if I take the same, if I take a sample of people of the exact same age and even give them the same material, the people that are, my hypothesis would be that the people who are studying at home because of, lack of distractions, comfort in their own space, will do better on that standardized test. So that's my hypothesis. The question was, is there a difference between, people who study for a standardized test at home versus in a classroom? Hypothesis, I'm now predicting, saying that people at home will do better on this exam in this given situation. A theory is a lot bigger, so it's synthesizing observations in order to explain phenomenon and guide predictions to be tested through research. So the example I always use here is gravity. So we understand gravity to be a law now, but at first it was just a theory. It was just an idea that, if that there was this sort of invisible force that was pulling us towards the center of the earth, which there is. So there we're trying to make sort of grander claims. It says synthesizing observations. So not just about one specific area, but my theory in that case, we're going back to our example of remote learning and standardized tests, is that people who, study at home are doing better on standardized tests. And then I can use a series of experiments to help test that theory. Hypothesis is actually like the thing that we're actually exactly testing, whereas theory is sort of broader and incorporates a lot of them. Operational definition, the precise manner in which a variable of interest is defined and measured. Operational definitions are very important because there's this idea called internal validity and external validity. We'll go over that a lot over the course of the semester, but we're trying to make sure that other people can replicate our experiment and that our experiment is as valid as possible, and like that our study is well set up, and that if we ran it 100 times, we get the exact same results. That's the ideal situation, and having operational definitions is a part of that. So if I'm testing remote learning, I need to have an operational definition for what remote learning actually is, because it can mean different things to different people. So if I have a very strong set of definition, that will hopefully make it more valid and make it a better experiment. So the example they use here is attraction. So if we're studying like attraction within individuals or a group, like the psychology of attraction, we're actually going to have to like define that term, just so academically people can look at it and go, okay, that's what they mean, because attraction can mean different things to different people. All right, so when gathering data, researchers must remain objective. The idea of controlling a variable, we will go over that a lot. Okay, so there is a difference between descriptive and inferential statistics. Okay, so descriptive statistics are just describing a phenomenon. It's exactly what it sounds like. We ran this experiment. This is what it said. That's a descriptive statistic. An inferential statistic is trying to create meaning from those numbers. Okay, so there is a different types of experiments that will lead us to different types of data. If you're doing a survey, that would be a descriptive statistic, where it's not an inferential statistic, because you're not trying to gain a whole lot of meaning from just collecting a bunch of data. So if I surveyed our class of, what's your favorite color? A descriptive statistic would be that, 40% of respondents said that their favorite color was purple because it's a nice color. An inferential statistic I would try and take that stat and make some sort of grander observation about it. So, I'd be like, well, because we're close to Clemson, it follows that purple would be a popular color around these parts, which it is. But that is an inference that I'm making from that descriptive statistics. The statistics that I've collected don't actually say that. I'm just from there sort of extrapolating that out onto observations I've already made externally outside of that specific research setup. And then from there, we can look and see, does the result support the hypothesis? So if my hypothesis coming into that was, I predict that because we are close to Clemson, X number of people are going to pick purple, then yes, it would support the hypothesis, but I wouldn't be able to say that, because what I would have to do is then test it against people who don't live close to Clemson. But did the results support the hypothesis? You can't always say that based on the type of statistic that you're collecting. Sharing our knowledge, peer-reviewed publication. Peer review is very important. The idea that multiple people who are experts within that field have viewed that research and passed it off, because a lot of times we'll have research that just gets chucked out of the world because academia can be very competitive, and especially like big companies that are trying to sell something will rush some sort of study out there. But having it peer reviewed is very important. So hopefully mitigate that sort of incorrectness of study being put out into the world. And then public presentations at conferences, also an important thing, especially if you're trying to get into academia as a career. Value in sharing our knowledge. Well, that's why we do these things most of the time. That's not just for our own personal satisfaction. We're trying to answer questions about psychology. And so the only way that we can sort of build on that research base is by sharing. Ethics in publication, because data meddling is the thing. Example they use here is vaccine and autism, because you can definitely alter data to make it look like it supports your conclusion. Replication, so you need to be able to repeat something. That falls under the external validity category, which we'll talk about later. New sample, other changes to procedures, the goal of which is to provide further support for the findings of the first study. So even if you change the experimental design, we're trying to get to findings of the first study. Asking new questions, so we talked about it being a cycle. So always starting with a question, ending with publishing the findings after we've analyzed the data, and then it starts back over again. Somebody ideally would read your findings and then have another question based off of your question. And then it would just repeat, and we would slowly but surely build off of that knowledge base. That is what science is, like this cycle right here. That we continue to get new information and we make new observations based off that information. That's critical thinking. Right, so I'm weighing pieces of evidence, synthesizing them, evaluating and determining the contributions of each. Discipline thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. Okay, so that's what we are trying to get to at this point. So some very important questions, and this is a very relevant sort of set of inquiries in a time where we are trying to solve very big problems with science. So, so starting at who wrote the article? What is the professional background of the author? Because there are better researchers than others. How much work have they published? Are they at a major university? Things like that. Where was it published? Is it peer reviewed, open source, or popular press? So peer reviewed is going to typically, and I don't, I understand why this exists, but it can be very annoying. That a lot of time the best research is sort of behind a paywall and in these very fancy journals that people have to pay to access. You don't actually. So Greenville Tech, as a lot of schools do, have a very good partnership with a lot of academic journals. So you can use your email address for the school, or even just go to the school's computer lab and find good studies, which will become relevant once we get to our paper. What are the study's findings? So we will actually go over probably next class a study and how to interpret what's in it. So because if I'm feeling kind of lazy, which happens quite a bit, I will look at a study and I will just go straight to the conclusion and read that first, because that's where the important stuff is. So they start with their sort of introduction, their methodology, and they will say their hypothesis. And then in the discussion, in the conclusion, they will say whether or not their findings, which was outlined further up in the article, supported what their hypothesis was, and if there were any limitations that they found. So if they didn't control for a certain variable, or somewhere along the way in their experiment they were like, oh, we probably should have done it this way, they might say that, and that can be sort of misleading, because you're like, oh, well, you guys are dumb, why'd you do that? But that's actually, first of all, their ethical responsibility to tell you. And that actually makes it better research for them to say this, we should have done this. Because ideally, going back to that cyclical conversation, another scientist could pick up on that and be like, well, we're going to study that this time. So that's just them being open and candid and smart. So what are the variables might have influenced the outcomes? We talked about, we'll talk about extraneous and confounding variables later, but that can definitely heavily impact the results of your study. What were the methods used to conduct the study? How big was the sample? This is a really important one. So we talked about case studies and how most of the time in a case study, that's going to be an example. That's a sample size of 1 or very small. It's borderline impossible to make like big generalizations from a case study or even a series of case studies. So the big sample size, typically the bigger the sample size, the more reliable that data is going to be, the more applicable it's going to be to that big question. And then how did the researchers collect the data? It's within that published study, they will tell you exactly, hopefully, how they collected their data through their methods, And I will hopefully help teach you how to determine what is a good method of collecting data and what is not. Has the study been replicated? This is a really important one. Have other studies reported the same results? Have similar studies been conducted? Because if there's just this one group in like 2006 that did this one time and nobody else is taking a stab at it, that's like, have other studies try different samples? There's another thing. So we talked about representation and how things can vary from culture to culture. So if it's the only information available is done in the southern part of the United States, that's not going to be super applicable to somebody living, in Taiwan. So it is good to look at a variety of samples geographically across genders, across different cultures. That will give you a much broader base. Talked about salmon and ice. So in this case, with twins, you have the exact same set of DNA, so that eliminates a variable, measurable characteristics that can carry over time or people. So we can actually look at specific things like, what are their hobbies? What, type of shows did they like to watch? Things like that, and measure that because, in theory, their biology is the same. Okay, so we're going to get into this very briefly. I'm not going to talk about it a ton, but population. So if we're talking about our classroom, population is everybody in that classroom. Okay, so all members of an identified group about which a researcher is interested. So if I'm trying to go back to our study of color, if I'm trying to see what everybody's favorite color is, my population is the entire population of that class. A sample is a subset of that class. So all of y'all may not be available to participate in my little experiment, you may not want to. So what I'm going to do, if if I have 80 kids across 3 classes, which I do, I may choose to sample 25 of those kids. And that can obviously become a little problematic. We'll talk about why in a second, but the sample is that subset of the population chosen for inclusion in an experiment. So I'm using those 25 people to make inferences about the 80 people at large, hoping that the sample I choose is representative of the population, which may not be, because the most ethically sound way to do this is through a random sample. I say it's ethically sound because it eliminates researcher bias, because who you choose to participate in your experiment matters. So a random sample in this case, a subset of the population chosen through a procedure that ensures all members of the population have an equal chance of being selected to participate in the study. So if I had all of your names on a list, I plugged it into a computer and I said, computer, choose me 25 names. And I had no control over which names were going to be included. That would limit bias because I didn't get to choose. I might know that somebody likes purple or somebody's a Clemson fan, might increase their likelihood of choosing purple. So the computer, and the random sample in this case eliminates that as a possibility. That being said, where that can get a little tricky is those 25 may not represent the subgroup of, it may not represent that population as a whole. So if we have 60%, 60+% girls in that 80 people, which we do, and out of my 25 people, 18 of them are guys, that's not a representative sample. Okay, so you have to find that balance between ethically sound, you're moving your own bias from it, and also having a sample that represents your population as a whole. Especially if we're trying to get a lot of information about answering a big topic, and we'll just use vaccines as an example. That is very, very, very important to get a representative sample, because we don't want to, incorrectly interpret the data that we've collected. Population and sample, we talked about that. All right, so we'll get through descriptive research methods and we'll be done. All right, descriptive research methods, type of investigation psychologists use to explore a phenomenon. So we're just getting information about it. We're not trying to we'll talk about inferential research methods in a second. Useful for studying new or unexplored topics. Okay, so the limitation is I cannot determine cause and effect relationships between variables. All I can do is collect data about it. So we're going back to our example of, if I find out that 40% of your favorite color is purple, that doesn't really tell me that much. It just, all I have is that very specific bit of information. There's 4 ways that we can do this. Naturalistic observation. So if somebody were to come in to our class and was trying to figure out, who participates in class discussion the most. They could come in for a few class periods and naturalistically observe who was answering questions. Okay. Case study, we're talking about, very small sample size. We're looking at one specific instance of this phenomenon occurring. Survey method, this is very good when you have a very, very large population. You're trying to get just like a very broad swath of data. So something like the census, where we're trying to determine how many people, what kind of people live in the US. It can be a little trickier because, with the census specifically, that helps determine like number of congressional seats per state. And we'll talk about surveys and how they can be a little complicated, but correlations also trying to establish a very basic connection between variables, not a causal one though. All right, so we're talking about twins. These are the Jim twins, they're separated shortly after birth, and all these weird similarities that they have over the course of their life. And then the question they ask here is, can this case study help you generalize about twins? And the answer is no, okay, because the sample size isn't big enough. It's just two dudes who we can just chalk all this up to coincidence. It's not scientifically responsible of us to say, oh, well, all twins are going to exhibit these behaviors, because we don't know that. Okay, so survey method. If you watch a lot of Family Feud, you'll understand how this works very basically. Descriptive research that uses questionnaires or interviews to gather data. Allows research to gather a lot of data very quickly. Must be mindful of wording of the questions, may lead to response bias and participant honesty. Okay, so people lie a lot, especially if their answers are anonymous. Well, I guess, yeah, either way. But they just lie. They want to represent themselves as favorably as possible. And so if you're asking a difficult question about like, what kind of type of TV you watch, if the question is, if you watch a lot of TV that has violence in it, somebody is less likely to be like, yes, I watch a lot of TV with violence, because the way that is worded it makes it seem like the violent TV is less favorable. And then also, like it says here, skimming the surface doesn't understand why people respond the way they do, just that they respond in a certain way. And that low response rates may lead to a non-representative sample. Okay, so we're going to save past the survey until next time, because I've been going for a while. So got up to surveys, we'll finish correlational methods and get into, well, not correlational, we'll finish descriptive methods, get into inferential ones next time. Remember that your assignments are due Sunday night at midnight. If you have any questions about your assignments, just let me know and we can get that figured out together. But until then, I will see you guys on Thursday. Peace out.